Hello, welcome to another Brookbanks podcast. I'm Ben Wakeling, the head of cost and commercial here at Brookbanks, and I'm very pleased to have with me today Paul Brocklehurst, the chairman of the Land Planning and Development Federation. It's a great pleasure to have you on, Paul. Thank you. Today we're going to be talking about SME developers and the challenges they face, what's currently being done about it, and what more can be done to help unlock housing. But before we get into that, Paul, I'll just pass over to you. Could you just give us a brief history of who you are in your career so far?
Delighted to, Ben, and thank you for inviting me to speak on what is a pet topic for me. So, as you say, Paul Brocklehurst, chairman of the Land Planning and Development Federation, which I was very proud to play a leading role in bringing to fruition in 2018. Basically, my background after an initial period in banking, in corporate banking, I've spent the last 20 years in property as a developer and as a land promoter, bringing forward sites, trying to get planning consent, largely for residential use. And as a consequence, I speak with a large degree of knowledge about the challenges that presents to my members. The LPDF basically is a body represents land promoters and house builders, and we have a cross-section of sizes. So many of them are SMEs themselves. So we are very focused on championing the challenges and specific challenges that they have had to face over the last 40 years, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I say, it's great to have you on. I'm really looking forward to getting stuck into this. First of all, though, to frame the discussion a bit, when we talk about an SME developer, what kind of developer are we putting into that category? Is it someone who does a certain number of units a year, I presume?
I think that's a really great question, and it's actually not as simple to answer as one would think. If you read the National Planning Policy Framework, then it would define an SME developer as basically people who do site sizes of up to 9 units. I think that might be an adequate definition of what is a small developer, but it ignores the medium part of the SME naming. And so I think a medium-sized developer could be somebody that potentially develops up to 500, 1,000 homes a year. Basically, somebody who is not a volume house builder, does not operate on a multi-regional basis, maybe operates in one region, 2 at most, and is also likely to be privately owned, funded by private capital, and often, as a consequence, has some leverage and debt capital. And often that is a financial structural definition as well. But for me, the definition of SME is far broader than is currently defined in government policy. And I think an acknowledgement of that is desperately required, because it is those developers that we've lost, of those kind of sizes, all of those developers from 10 to 1,000 have disappeared over the last 40 years for a variety of reasons, which I'm sure we can discuss. But for me, it is a much more wide-ranging definition than that which has, for at least the last 10, 15 years, been in government planning policy.
That's an interesting point, because it then feels to me that maybe there's a huge swathe of developers who have almost been forgotten about over the last 10 years, maybe because there's not been that focus on the medium size of things. And so a lot of SMEs, I should imagine, are being treated when it comes to planning applications and regulations and so on. And we'll come to talk about them in a bit more detail later. But I suppose they're almost being treated like large developers, like volume developers. They're having to jump through the same hurdles as the large house builders that are national.
Absolutely. The definitions in the planning, from a planning policy point of view, that is absolutely correct. then. And, in fairness to small developers, I'm not sure that they've experienced any real benefit from being defined as a small development in terms of planning either. But actually medium-sized developers have definitely not experienced that, because they've effectively been lumped in with large-scale development and major development, such as, let's say, a 1,000 or a 2,000 dwelling scheme. So I don't think there is any one of our lords, a peer, Lord Banner, recently tried to introduce the concept of proportionality into the planning and infrastructure bill as it was going through Parliament recently. And I think the point is that there is no proportionality at the moment applied, so that you can have a medium-sized site and it is dealt with by the system exactly as the same as a 2,000 dwelling scheme. It is an unfair disadvantage for those kind of developers.
Absolutely, and I think and all the costs that come with that. But let's go on to challenges in just a second. I think before we do that, let's just put a spotlight on SME developers as a whole, because everyone knows the big house builders. They know the Vistries, the Taylor Wimpey's, the Persimmons, and they churn out, or they build, I should say, circa 10,000 homes each a year, something like that, and it may range a bit. But, and I think I'm right in saying this, that's only really 40% of the homes built in the UK each year. Am I right in saying that? So what I'm trying to say is SMEs and other firms actually have got a lot of slack to take up and a lot to do.
Yeah, I think the issue is SMEs have delivered a lower and lower percentage of overall housing delivery in the UK over the last 40 years. The sort of analysis is that back in the 1980s, it was something like 40% or nearly 40% of housing was delivered by SME developers. Now, actually, that percentage is much closer to 10%. And as you say, we've got volume house builders. So the top 10 or 20 deliver a large proportion of our housing. Then in addition, we have all of the registered providers as well, who would be recognised as delivering a large proportion of the housing in the country. It's more recently been running at 40 to 50,000 a year in terms of affordable housing delivery. We have seen a decades-long decline in the SME's contribution to overall housing delivery. And what anybody thinks about the government's overall ambition and whether it will be achieved in this Parliament, the only way that the government can achieve greater housing delivery is through reigniting the delivery that comes from SMEs and encouraging other people to invest, grow their businesses, and to do that, they need to make it easier and less risky for people to do so. So I think they can make a material contribution. I think the issue is you can't just recorrect a 40-year decline in a short period of time. And I think one of the problems with the housing debate sometimes is people think you change a policy and that it will have an immediate impact within 6 to 12 months. But actually, that isn't the case. We've done research recently which shows that over the last 10 plus years, the average determination period for a planning application has increased from 6 months to nearly 2 years. Now, everybody in the planning system has experienced that, but actually for an SME, if they experience it, it creates huge problems for how they can run their business. And I think this is one of the reasons we've seen the decline in SMEs. Going back to, the 2-year period, if you haven't changed today and we are seeing application numbers increasing, actually those sites with 2-year determination periods won't get a planning consent until 2027.
Yeah.
And that's often an outline planning consent, so it still needs to get a reserved matters application and have discharge of conditions as well. And we all know how long that process can take. So let's call that another 12 or 18 months. Effectively, that is the end of the Parliament we're talking about.
Yes. Yeah, it's not just flipping a switch. It takes years to see any kind of benefit from any policy change.
I think that's the political dilemma, really, that the current government is facing. But I am absolutely clear that in the long run, we immediately need more houses. We have a housing crisis. I think really everybody acknowledges that at a national political level. We need to do more about it as quickly as we can. And for me, SMEs are a large part of the solution. They're not the only part. You need to throw everything at it, to be perfectly honest. But the SMEs are a huge part of the equation, and they face many, many challenges.
So let's talk about the challenges faced by SMEs. And what I would say before we go into that is there's a really good letter that the LPDF have published or issued to the Treasury in the middle of October, 15th of October, which sets out a lot of the challenges faced, not just by SME developers, but by the industry as a whole, and some suggestions for overcoming those. And so anybody wants any additional reading, I would definitely suggest you head over to the LPDF website and take a look at that. But we're focusing just for the moment on SME developers then. And so let's say you're Brocklehurst Limited is an SME developer. We mentioned planning. That's got to be one of your biggest challenges. Am I right?
Yes, you're right. It's one of the challenges at the moment, largely because you're caught up. You opened earlier making absolutely a very valid point. But, if our research across all applications is showing that the determination period is lengthened to 2 years, you're caught up with everybody else in that same malaise and inertia. And of course, you're probably a business that has had to make forecasts or assumptions based on how long you hope or expect that application to actually take to be determined. So any delay beyond your forecast is going to impact your cash flow. But in addition, going back to the point of proportionality, your site may only be 40 or 50 units, but in terms of the report expectations that are expected by the local planning authority, you may need to do exactly the same number of reports as a very large application. So whether it's landscape, let's say. Now, perhaps if you're in a national landscape, whether you're 49 or 249, you do have to do a landscape assessment. But actually, if there are no designations and you are a smaller or medium-sized site, is it appropriate to do the same type of assessment as a larger site, which has by definition is going to have a bigger landscape impact, or likely to? Do you always have to do noise quality reports? Back in the day, if we go back 40 years again, actually an outline application was a red line round a plan, a short planning statement, and potentially a highways assessment. Now, I think overlaying that was probably these days the requirement you should have for flooding. But, we can find reasons to do every kind of report. But part of the issue we have is trying to find reasons to strip it back so that these businesses can participate in the what I think should be a national endeavour to deliver housing. So I think the cost of planning applications has increased. The time to actually consider them as I've outlined has increased substantially, and all of that has an impact on owner-managed businesses and how they can actually manage the cash flow and profitability and balance sheets of their business. And sometimes, of course, they've got bank debt on board, and they're trying to say to the bank, "Oh, I'm expecting my reserve matters or my outline consent," and it hasn't come in. So, I think people need to appreciate the challenges that are there. Planning is one part of it, but the planning part of it does also link on, because actually what the planning system has become is a tool to get and more contributions. So BNG, building safety levy, nutrient neutrality, water neutrality in certain areas of the country. All of these things impact on cost and ability to get on site, and often to get a planning consent in the first place.
Absolutely.
Go on.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, you mentioned building safety levy there, and just as an aside, these are small and medium-sized developers who have had little to no involvement in high-rise. Why should they be hit with a levy that is aimed at volume house builders? It's a disproportionate cost. And you mentioned the cost of planning applications, and I think it was the Home Builders Federation that did a report recently, or published a report recently, that said that the average cost of planning applications is about £125,000, and for a site that's lower than 50 units, it averages around £3,500 a unit. Yeah, that's a lot of money for an SME to foot.
But I think 2 points dealing with the second first. It isn't just the cost; it's the risk. So I think people could cope with the cost in one sense, not everybody. And I'm not suggesting that it shouldn't be a lower cost. But if you layer on that the fact that you have no real idea whether you're going to get the answer that you wish and in a certain period of time, I think it makes the whole risk-reward equation, which is what business is about, business is about understanding risk and reward. It makes it impossible to understand the outcome of that equation. And as I outlined earlier, I think in relation to a number of planning applications, the default position should be you don't have to do reports if you're a certain size of site in a particular area. But and then looking at the first point, which Ben, you'll need to help me. What was the first question?
It was about building safety levy.
Sorry. First of all, I think there's a simple answer to that. They shouldn't be paying it. Yeah. They shouldn't be paying it because they were not involved in creating the problem in the first place. Now, I think there's a good point here, which my colleagues in the HBF would wish me to make, which is I'm not even sure that volume house builders should be paying it, because they're already meeting the remediation costs for the large buildings and tall buildings that they constructed. And then, of course, the rest of the stock they were constructing was 2-story, which isn't really caught up in any of this issue. So they're paying for other people's problems. That's what the sector is now doing through the building safety levy. So it's not a particularly fair tax all round, but it is particularly unfair on small and medium-sized house builders.
And is this just a byproduct of the policy maybe not having been thought through enough? I'm not just talking about building safety levy. I'm also talking about nutrient neutrality and BNG, biodiversity net gain. The policies are maybe kind of well-intentioned, but it feels like it's just been implemented as just a sweeping policy across all builders. It feels to me like if there had been a bit more thought given early days to who these policies should apply to, it could save a lot of back and forth and a lot of challenge for SMEs.
Yeah, I think that it's a really good point. I think what has happened is I don't think, and I think this is a broader comment if I'm honest, I don't think government fully understand what it is like to have to run a small and medium-sized enterprise. And I think that is a general statement, but it applies in particular to house builders in this instance. And as a consequence, policy formation does not really consider how SMEs have the ability to react, because in many instances they don't. They don't have the financial resources to withstand the kind of impacts that policy actually applies. And for me, that is why we've gone from 40% of our housing being delivered by SMEs to close to 10% now. Is because of the cumulative impact of all the policy changes over the decades of all sorts, those businesses. And at the end of the day, they just do not have the cash resources, balance sheet to be able to withstand all of these things.
So you've got planning issues with delays, and we haven't even touched on Section 106 negotiations, but that gets factored in as well. You've got planning costs that are prohibitive, and policies, BSL and all the rest of it. And we've got, as you say, cash flows and SMEs that may not be financially resilient enough to withstand these shocks. Let's just touch it. The final point on challenges, just quickly on labour availability. And this is something that affects the whole construction industry, is just there's not enough skilled labour to go around.
I think that's one of the other reasons why I say these issues are not easily dealt with in a short period of time, because you need to deal with labour and materials availability to enable more build. And so from that point of view, yes, you're right. I think you need to encourage people to want to go into house building, and you need to show them the career routes that they would have and the ability, how they can progress and how they can a good standard of living from it. Now, I think the industry is doing a lot more in that regard, and I think there's always more that can be done. But as I say, I think there's a variety of issues there. There's how our further and higher education colleges are now organised, whether they're offering the right courses, whether the lecturers for those courses are paid the right amount of money, bearing if they're a qualified plasterer, they could probably earn more from actually being a plasterer than actually teaching at a further education college. All of these kind of points need to be dealt with.
I was just going to say, like we touched on before, these things don't happen overnight. To get to a point where you've got enough plasterers, enough bricklayers, enough carpenters on a site, there are so many things that happen before that point that are, in inverted commas, broken, or at least not working as they should, that takes so much time to turn around. It's you're turning around a tanker here, aren't you?
I think absolutely. I mean, look, there are things that can be done, and there are things that can be done to encourage people into the industry. And I think, funnily enough, of course, modern methods of construction was one way of doing that. But of course, actually, I feel sorry for all of those people and all of those investors who invested money in the factories for modern methods of construction, because the government didn't follow through on what was required. And what was required when you're building factories, you need to keep them fully occupied. It needs to be moving, 24/7 to get the full efficiencies from having that high fixed cost. And for a variety of reasons, not least that the planning consents weren't coming through, basically the factories weren't fully occupied. And what happens is they go bust. But of course, they were a way of encouraging a different group of people into the industry, because often you hear people of saying, don't want to work in the rain and the, freezing cold, whatever it may be. Actually, when a large part of the construction was being done in factories, nobody was having to do that. So it is as part of the solution, but actually what it required is effectively a demand which wasn't there, partially because planning consents weren't coming through quickly enough.
Yeah, so it's all these ripple effects. Okay, so let's start talking about things that are in place and what else could happen to help unblock these challenges. And so we've had a Labour government now for a year and a bit. We started in the construction industry with Angela Rayner as Housing Secretary. We more recently got Steve Reed in as a replacement. Before we talk about what the Labour government has introduced or said they'll introduce so far, you met Steve Reed recently, I believe. What are your thoughts? He's got an awfully big task ahead of him.
I met Steve Reed last night, as it happens, at a Labour YIMBY event, and the Labour YIMBY events are fantastic because you walk into a room which has young people invigorated with the cause of building more homes. So building more private homes and building more affordable homes. And they are fully on board with that. And of course, that Chair Chine was our new Secretary of State's Build Baby Build. So I think there's a photograph with me in a red hard hat with Build Baby Build on it. And I'm sure it'll be useful when I visit site in the future. But so I think there's no doubt that central government intent is to see more building. And look, they were extremely quick and efficient in reversing most of the changes that the Conservative government made in the MPPF in December 2023. That was all done within 6 months of being re-elected or being elected, this new Labour government. And then I think a highly innovative new planning policy, one of the major changes in planning policy of the last 40 years was the grey belt policy. And that was brought in February. I have to say, since then, momentum feels as if it's slowed, notwithstanding, the new Secretary of State's desire. But the Planning and Infrastructure Bill was passed. There are undoubtedly some helpful changes in there. We have been lobbying for quite a while now for a raft of changes, some of them focused on SME. The government consulted on the introduction of a new medium-sized site threshold, interestingly. We think it's a little bit too small, but, we'd accept it. But actually, what it doesn't do is tell us what the benefits of being defined as a medium-sized site would be in a planning sense. Is there some kind of super presumption in favour of development if you are a site of 30 or 40 dwellings? Do you have to, as a local authority, provide 30% of your housing need in medium-sized sites, or whatever the percentage is? It has to feed through into practical benefits. I think then, in addition, for us, there are a raft of things, and you alluded to one actually, Ben. There are a raft of things to improve determination periods that need to be done. I think NDMPs, National Development Management Policies, could be powerful for the industry as a whole and SMEs. I think standardising Section 106, we as a federation have been talking about it for years. And I applaud the work of Simon Ricketts at Town Legal, who has led a bit of a working group to look at it. And I think that's kind of approaching a conclusion. It was a recommendation of the MHCLG Select Committee yesterday that Section 106s were standardised. And so, it would shorten the process. And it's a highly frustrating part of the process if you've been given a resolution to grant and you can't actually get the decision notice because you can't agree the Section 106 agreement. I think some of the other things, there are issues for SMEs around registered provider interests, because I think registered providers are finding that the affordable housing element from a management point of view is more difficult for them on those kind of sites. You know, if it's 5, 10, 15 units of something of that nature, and there's less interest. So I think to overcome that, the government are going to have to think about things for medium-sized sites of, you know, commuted sums, off-site contributions, which might allow local authorities to build council housing. They should think about making more flexible on BNG with SME-sized sites. So there's a raft of things that I think they need to do to support SME.
Yeah, and it feels like the government is receptive to a lot of those. So you mentioned just about the Section 106. It does feel, it doesn't feel like, it feels like there's a lot to do, but maybe you're not, you know, knocking at a closed door.
I don't think the door is closed. I think government has a lot on its plate. I think within MHCLG, you need to realise that they're not only dealing with these planning related issues, but they're dealing with devolution, strategic planning, local government reorganisation. They're taking up a huge amount of bandwidth, sort of managing those within MHCLG. But the door is open to a number of these things, you know, and I just hope that they take a bold step through that door and not just tiptoe across the threshold.
Yes.
And I think I've likened, with what we've had for 40 years is death by 1,000 cuts. But what we need to change it is not incremental positive change. We need bold changes if we're going to see a meaningful impact on economic growth, turning around this oil tanker, as you said. But a number of these things that I've mentioned are all under active consideration. And I'm hoping that over the next 3 to 6 months, we'll see some positive developments on a raft and a range of fronts there. I'm just concerned they're not bold enough, and I want them to be bold.
Thank you. So we're almost out of time. I think the final question I have was, if an SME developer is listening to this with the challenges that they face that we've discussed, what would be your one piece of advice to them to go away after this podcast is finished and look at or consider? What would be the next step for an SME developer to continue to be solvent and hopefully successful?
Well, I think it's hard to answer because I actually don't know. I think this is one of the issues within SMEs. Each SME is very different from the other. You know, it depends. Are you exposed to a large number of sites that are awaiting a planning decision? And for me to provide advice on what to do in those circumstances is very difficult. Each site will be very different. And, you know, it's wrong of me to just say, well, appeal, because appeal increases the cost materially. So I don't think I can give that advice. I think in terms of sales and impact on sales, because the market is not easy at the moment, sales rates in many parts of the country are not strong. I think, look, there are loads of people who are very conscious and are trying very hard to get back some demand side support. If you can, hold on, because I hope that, going to your point, Ben, some change is coming, and that people will recognise the pressures on SMEs, and we should be clear on what those changes will be over the next 3 to 6 months. But I think one bit of advice, I having been an SME business myself, I think every business is different, and I think everybody is faced with different challenges. So I'd be being trite, I think, to try and give a piece of advice.
Fair enough. Yeah, it was a curveball question. So Thank you, Paul, for your time. It's been a fascinating conversation. If anybody wants to get in touch with you to find out a bit more, what's the best way of them contacting you?
I'm on LinkedIn. Feel free to contact me at my LPD email, which is paulb@lpdf.co.uk. We're delighted. We've got loads of small and medium-sized promoters and house builders as members, and we are very, very focused on supporting everybody in the sector.
Fabulous, thank you. And from my point of view, Brookbanks can offer a range of services to SMEs to help try and unlock some of these challenges. Head over to brookbanks.com. You can find out there what we do and how we do it, and you can get in touch with us through there as well. So it remains for me to thank you again, Paul Brocklehurst, Chairman of the Land Planning and Development Federation. Thank you very much for your time, and hopefully speak to you soon.
Thanks, Ben.